Beautiful. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Rosemary Grady. I'm here with Black Humboldt. Thank you for joining our speaker series this week for Juneteenth. We are honoring the past to see the future. I have some information to share about all of our festivities coming up this week. And so I'll just do that quickly before introducing our speaker today, Thomas. So today we have our speaker series, Exploring the State of Black Mental Health with Thomas Lee. We're going to examine the current state of Black mental health as well as the barriers that often prevent members of the Black community from seeking treatment and support. And then tomorrow we also have a speaker series continued, and it's What is Juneteenth? What is Lineage? With the Black Humboldt Hub. We also have some events going on throughout the week for our friends and our family. So today, Thursday, June 18th, we'll be at the skate park with DJ Professor Funk at 6 p.m. at Blue Lake Skating Rink. Tomorrow we'll be taking over Friday Night Markets in Old Town at 5:30, and we also have an all ages punk show at 7 p.m. Saturday, we hope you join us for our all-day Juneteenth festival, and that is 12 p.m. at Halverson Park in Eureka. And we have an after party at Richard's Goat. As Club Auntie is hosting the event, we have a Black burlesque party, and I believe the theme is cow, boy, girl, they, them. So bring out your best cow fits. And then Saturday or Sunday, we have our Black Brunch and Ball. And so that is a ticketed event. So be sure to get tickets to that as well. And then I will just go into our Juneteenth speaker series. So we are here with Thomas Lee. He is a licensed marriage and family therapist. We're going to explore the historical and cultural and institutional forces that continue to shape Black mental health. This presentation will begin with the history of how African people were brought to the United States and the psychological impact of enslavement, displacement, violence, and generational trauma. Thomas will explore the events and systems that followed slavery, including experiences that compounded trauma and contributed to a longstanding distrust of healthcare and mental health institutions. The session will consider the current state of Black mental health and the barriers that can prevent Black community members from seeking treatment, including the stigma, the cost, the limited access, cultural misunderstanding, and a lack of trusted providers. This conversation will create a space to name the historical roots of present-day mental health challenges while encouraging greater compassion, openness, culturally responsive care, and community support. And so more about Thomas Lee. He is a licensed marriage and family therapist in California. He earned a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from the University of Memphis and a Master of Arts in Mental Health Counseling from the University of Central Florida in 2014. Throughout his counseling career, Thomas has worked in residential treatment centers, nonprofit organizations, clinics, and private practices. His experiences include supporting formerly incarcerated and unhoused people, Black communities and other communities of color, and members of the LGBTQIA+ community. Thomas is also the author of The Miseducation of Thomas Lee Crockett, a mental health love letter to the Black community. And that was published by Wilding Press, and the book is scheduled to release later this month on June 30th, 2026. So thank you, Thomas, for being here. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We'll have a Q&A at the very end. And if you have any thoughts or any aha moments, you could put them in the chat. But I'm going to hand it off to you, Thomas.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I really appreciate it. First and foremost, I do want to say thank you to Black Humboldt for extending me this opportunity to be here today and speak to you guys because I'm super duper excited because I love being in community with my folks and talking to my folks. And this is also a great opportunity for me to talk about the two things I love most, which are Black people and mental health. So it's like, yay, a win for me. So I'm super excited. So I do want to talk about the current state of mental health. And I want to talk about this a little bit in depthly. And I often tell people, um, you know, we didn't just get here. There's been like a series of events or a series of things that have happened that led to how Black people feel in this country today that affect our mental health. And I want to take some time during this speech to really sit here and explore Black history and see how certain significant Black events shaped Black America, Black culture, and shaped the Black experience to what it is today in terms of like what we live every day and that impact on our mental health. So within this speech, I will be starting off by going over some significant Black history. Then I'm going to talk about how those events may have created barriers that may affect the mental health of Black people today. Then I want to talk a little bit more about Black people and their distrust for basically the medical system. And then lastly, I want to end by talking about barriers for Black people to get mental health treatment. And so that's going to be the structure for today. And I just want to give you guys an overview before I just kind of hop right into it. And also, let me kind of say, too, as I'm talking about certain subjects and topics within this speech, I want to give you guys a trigger warning because Black history has a whole lot of pain. And I will be talking about subjects of sexual assault, physical abuse. And my aim here is not to trigger anybody, it's just to sit here and tell the history. If you do find yourself getting triggered, I ask that you please take care of yourself accordingly. Okay. So when I were working with clients, especially Black clients, I will always tell them first and foremost, like, if you are Black in America, you have trauma. How can you not have trauma? And I have to explain to people like we all experience trauma because of the way that Black people were brought into America. And we were brought into America through the transatlantic slave trade, which took place from 1500 to the 1900. And if you don't know what the you don't know what the transatlantic slave trade is, that is pretty much when white people from these white countries brought themselves over into Africa. And then they began to take Black people from their home and force them onto ships to be dropped off to another country to serve as slaves. And let me also mention that they were forcibly taken against their will. They didn't have a choice. And many people fail to acknowledge how much of big business the transatlantic slave trade was. The transatlantic slave trade took more than 15 million Africans from their home and forced them to go to another country and become enslaved. And I want to make this clear. Not only did the transatlantic slaves trade drop off slaves in America, those slave ships went all over the world. And so there are other countries out there in the world with Black people with a history of slavery towards Black people. I just want to make that clear. And so more than 15 million people were displaced from Africa. And don't get me started about their voyage to these new destinations through what we call the Middle Passage. And that's what when these Black people were put on these ships and then transported and dropped out to a new country. They called that the Middle Passage. And that was also a very hazardous and dangerous journey. The slaves were often packed in that ship to capacity. There was no ventilation. It was really horrendous conditions. And those conditions led to many Black people dying in the process of being delivered to another country. And there were also some Black people who were on that ship who were well aware of the fate that was ahead of them when they got dropped off to a new country. So they decided to self-delete. So millions died during the process of going to their new destination. Now, when we talk about the introduction of Black people into America, the first set of slaves hit America in 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia. This was the beginning of everything. I often got to sit here and tell people first and foremost, because these history books love to lie about what happened to Black people in our history. And I got to and tell people that first and foremost, the only reason that Black people were brought into America to begin with was solely economics. They needed Black bodies to work in the textile industry in the North. They needed Black bodies to work in the agriculture industries in the South. So the Black people would be working in the cotton mills and also the sugar mills, but mainly cotton. By 1860, the majority of the U.S. wealth came from all the labor that the slaves were doing in the cotton field. Cotton became big business for America. And due to slave producing so much cotton, slaves themselves also became valuable within themselves. Slaves were not seen as people, they were seen as livestock. And so slaves often had a monetary value that came with a couple of K's behind it. And if a slave owner found himself in dire need, they could sell a slave and receive financial compensation for selling another human being. So when I sit here and look at our textbooks today and how they choose to go over slavery, I remember reading this one article where in the textbook, they referred to the slaves as Black immigrants. And I'm just like, no, 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 that's not true. Because in my mind, when I think of immigrants, I think of somebody willingly making the choice to come to another country. For Black people, we didn't get that option. Our ancestors were forced into it. And when I say into it, they were forced onto a board. I'm sorry, they were forced onto a boat, brought here against their will, and forced to work. They didn't have a choice. So there's nothing about immigration that aligns with that to me. And so I want to make that very, very clear. And then I also saw how textbooks often diluted the brutality of slavery. So what many people don't talk about is how the slaves were really forced to work in hazardous conditions. Slaves were forced to do 14 to 18 hours of manual labor, and they will be working in these conditions such as like the cotton mills and the sugar mills. And sometimes these were very, very unsafe places to work. You can lose a limb, you can be mutilated. And they was doing this 14 to 18 hours per day. And let me also mention that they were never, ever compensated for their work. Everything they did, all the profit from their work went directly to the slave master. So this was going on. In addition to that, after slaves be working these laborers' hours, they would not even be provided with adequate living accommodations. They will be put in shacks that were not insulated or have any heat, and they will be stacked on top of one another. And then the slave masters wouldn't even give them an adequate amount of food. And so they didn't have enough food, and they were also not properly clothed. And so imagine someone working 14 to 18 hours per day, then you're not being fed adequately. You don't have the stuff that you need to just basically take care of your basic human needs. Because again, let me kind of mention the white slave masters didn't see the slaves who were Black people as people. They just saw them as livestock. And then let me talk a little bit about what would happen if the slaves, when working, they didn't meet their quota or they were not performing up to the satisfaction of master. This will also lead to physical abuse, where slaves would be whipped, they would be whipped, punished, or even sometimes lynched if they were not performing accordingly. Or if master did not like their behavior, they would beat and whip the slaves, often as a way to kind of keep them in line and to instill fear. And so they are dealing with all of this physical abuse that leaves psychological trauma. Let me also mention too how a lot of the slave women were subjected to sexual abuse from the slave masters and white sailors. And it was a lot of that going on, a lot of that happening very, very rampant. And so the Black people in this country was facing some severe and horrendous conditions. And let me also go back a little bit and talk a little bit about Black people being in this country. When they brought them over to this country, let me mention that they tried their damnedest to beat and strip the identity away from those Black Africans. They wouldn't allow them to go by their African name. They wouldn't allow them to practice their cultural norms or their spiritual practice, or all those stuff. They tried to strip these people of their identity, and they succeeded. Like they succeeded on some level, and they wouldn't allow the slaves to read or write because we are aware what happens when someone's able to read and write. When someone's able to read and write, they're able to develop critical thinking skills. And if you develop critical thinking skills, you can begin questioning what's happening around you. So they tried the best to keep them dumb, illiterate, and removed from their culture. So these were things that the Black people were facing while in slavery. And let me not mention too how during the course of slavery, how white people broke up the homes of many Black families. Again, slaves were not seen as people, they were seen as property, as livestock. And sometimes slaves would be forced to engage in sex with each other in order to produce children that master would sell off. And so now you having fathers being ripped away from their family, you have mothers being ripped away from their families, and you're having children being ripped away from their families because slaves, again, they had a monetary value on their bodies. And so now you got these families experiencing severe trauma. That was just the reality. So in 1863, Abraham Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves. And I often got to sit here and tell people, okay, Abraham Lincoln is not a good man. He didn't free the slaves because this was the right thing to do, and he believed that the people deserved to be free. He freed the slaves as a way to destabilize the South and punish them for their rebellion. Because by 1860, if I'm not mistaken, one third of the Southern population was slaves. And so he knew the best way to cripple them were to take away the slaves, which is why he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And I gotta tell people like he's not a good person. He's not a good man. This wasn't like an altruistic act. So I need you to keep that in the back of your mind. And so he signs this in 1863. And then 2 years later, June 19th, 1965, the last batch of slaves in Galveston, Texas, I'm sorry, the last slave in Galveston, Texas, get word that they are free. And this is how we get Juneteenth in that celebration, because now the last crop of slaves are free and Black people are fully emancipating in this country. Now, I want you to kind of sit here and just think and reflect upon this. You had a race of people who were enslaved from 1619 all the way up into 1865. This is 2.5 centuries of Black people being in bondage. All of a sudden, they're free. And let me mention, they were free. They were not giving any resources whatsoever. Everything that they were working towards when they were enslaved, all that money went to the slave masters. So they left with no financial compensation. The government gave them nothing. They said they were promised 40 acres and a mule, but they didn't get that. And so imagine during 2.5 centuries worth of being enslaved. And while experiencing that slavery, you experience physical abuse, sexual abuse. You have to deal with the trauma of your family being separated and being stripped of your culture. And now all of a sudden you're free, but yet you're not getting any tools to help rebuild yourself or your life. You're not getting any financial compensation, nor were they provided with any mental health services to help treat the trauma that they endured while in slavery. They were just pretty much told, you're free, go figure it out. And that's what ended up happening. And so then this brings me to the Black codes, where after 1865, the government in the South decided to establish these Black codes. And the Black codes were just basically a way of trying to police, enforce, and keep Black people disenfranchised and disempowered. And with the Black codes, if you didn't have a job or if you didn't have a place to stay, they would find a reason just to incarcerate you. So you can just basically, once you were incarcerated, you can go back into chains. And that was the realities. And the black codes lasted from 1863, sorry, 1865 is when the black codes were created, up until 1868. And then in 1868, what ended up happening was they created Jim Crow. And Jim Crow allowed separate but equal to exist, where all of a sudden, yes, we can legally discriminate against you as long as everything is equal. And so this is when you see this rise of like segregation within public spaces, such as like schools, hospitals, or even restaurants. There's a white only area, there's a black only area. And so they're trying to, and I want you to kind of sit here and think about this. These black people who have just been freed, they're trying to rebuild their life, but they're navigating a landscape that is keeping them disempowered, that is trying to prevent them from thriving and getting on their feet. And so that comes with a lot of psychological turmoil and trauma within itself, on top of the trauma that is already existent from slavery. They can be overwhelming from for anybody. So Jim Crow basically did that. And so there were a few black people, sorry, there were a few black people, well, I'm sorry. There were black people who were able to establish and create a life for themselves. And a lot of ways that Black people found financial freedom after being released from slavery and during the Reconstruction era, that was by selling chicken and watermelon. And basically, they were making such financial gains from selling this that white people saw it. And then, as a way to kind of deter them from selling it, they began making a mockery of it, saying that, like, this is a stereotype, a negative stereotype of Black people. And by doing that, they begin to shame the people from selling chicken and watermelon. And that stopped them from being more financially independent. And I want to sit here and talk about what happened when Black people did become financially independent, did become liberated from Black people. There have been instances in American history where there were Black towns such as Tulsa, Oklahoma, which we call Black Wall Street, Rosewood, Florida, and Oscarville, Georgia, where these were thriving Black towns that were able to rebuild after Reconstruction and build a community that was filled with Black people who were successful and had financial independence and wealth. But do you know what ended up happening? Every time that the Black people were being independent or built wealth, white people saw this, they came in and they burnt these things down to the ground. It's pretty much the equivalent of playing Monopoly with a 7-year-old, and then they don't like the fact that you're winning. Then they flip the board over and just and you just lose everything. And they basically burnt down everything and they massacred thousands and thousands of Black people. And the one that really kind of sticks out to me the most is Oscarville, Georgia, because many people don't even know that Oscarville, Georgia existed. And I think about Oscarville, Georgia today, how Lake Lanier is basically built over the graves of tons of Black people. Lake Lanier is built over Oscarville, Georgia, and many people are unaware of that. And so the thing that I kind of want to highlight and point out here is even when the people were trying to get ahead and move forward, Black people found some way to burn it all down, keep them disempowered, and keeping them low. That led to a lot of psychological trauma. So then we move over here into the civil rights era. And this is where people are trying to fight for rights, fight for equality, because they realized that the separate but equal was nothing but discriminatory BS. And the Black people were still disempowered. The Black people still couldn't get access, even though things are supposed to be equal for everybody. That wasn't a reality. So in the civil rights era, you see all these boycotts, these protests that were popping up as a way to begin to change the system in the way that America was. And a couple of things I want to kind of highlight because these are key things that were these are key events that were important for the fight for inequality. One being Brown versus the Board of Education, which took place in 1954. this allowed for the school system to be this allowed for the school system to be desegregated. And this is pretty much like one of the first instances of integration. And then another thing that I want to kind of point out is the Montgomery bus boycott, which lasted from 1955 to 1956, which is one of the biggest and effective protests in American history. And I want to make this clear about the Montgomery bus boycott because many people are unaware of this. That didn't end because, again, white people realized that they were doing something horrible and wrong or whatever, blah, blah, blah. The only reason that the Montgomery bus boycott ended was because the city of Montgomery almost went bankrupt. And so they changed it so that they wouldn't go bankrupt. And that always tends to be a trend when it comes down to Black rights and Black equality, where something only gets changed if it affects the money or if it can be of a hindrance to white people. And I want you to kind of like notice that trend. And then also during the civil rights era, we get Martin Luther King giving his famous "I Have a Dream" speech on the March on Washington. So these are significant events in civil rights history that I wanted to kind of point out. And the last little step that I want to make in Black history is the crack epidemic, because I feel like this is often overlooked in our society and is not talked about. And the crack epidemic affected the lives of millions of Black people. So in 1980s, crack rock hit the streets of the inner cities. And crack rock is just pretty much a rock version of powder cocaine. And when it hit the streets, you saw this increase of drug addiction and crime running rampant in the inner cities. At the time, Ronald Reagan was the president. He saw what's happened, and his response was the war on drugs. And one of the key components of the war on drugs was if someone was caught in possession of zero point 0.5 grams of a crack rock, they would be given a mandatory sentence of 5 years. Now, if somebody was caught with 500 grams of cocaine, they would also be giving a mandatory 5 year sentence. So when you look at the amount of people who did crack rock, 80% of them were Black. The white people did powder cocaine. This was specifically targeting Black and brown bodies, but Black specifically. And then what ended up happening in the 1980s, you saw this surge of Black people entering the prison system, being incarcerated at an alarming rate. And now you have families yet being separated again due to the rock, whether it be mom or dad in the streets chasing the high, or mom and dad being locked up for being on crack. And this led to tons of families being separated, which again is nothing new for Black people. So I talk about all these events because all these events played a role in the state of the world today and how Black people navigate the world that's around them. And it also created a lot of barriers that we face today that also hinders our mental health. So when I sit here and think about slavery or whatever, I think about slavery in the sense of that was a brutal and trying time, and our people suffered. And they suffered. And then I think specifically about everything they lost from cultural identity through self-respect from just being in bondage and being whipped and beaten, all those other things. And then I also think about how they were forced to work against their will, and yet they didn't receive one dime. Because again, everything that they made went to the white slave masters. And I think about when those white slave masters, like when they died, how they were able to pass down their money, their houses, which made a difference in the lives of their descendants. And with slaves, there was nothing to pass down. And generational wealth is something that can change a person's life. Because I sit here and think about, so what would have happened if the slaves got properly compensated and then they had houses and property to pass down to their descendants, and how that may affect us today? Had that happened, a lot of Black people may not have had a hard time trying to find the resources to enter college. Because guess what? Since mom and dad does not have to pay rent or a house note, that money that we would be using to pay for those things, we can actually have set aside to pay for our child's college. But that's not possible. Or that money that we were setting aside or whatever, if we have a medical emergency, we have the funds to take care of it. And I say that generational wealth makes a difference because it allows the descendants to be less stressed about money, how they're going to make things work. And that would have made a world of difference in many Black people's lives because for a lot of us, we're trying to figure out exactly, like how are we going to get access to this education? How are we going to get access to pay our medical bills or get our medication? So these are things that we worry about in our typical day to day. Then when I think about the black codes and I think about Jim Crow, my mind immediately goes to the police department. So the police department derived from the slave patrol, which were created in the 1700s in one of the Carolinas. And the slave patrol was basically these group of people that would basically get together and they will be policing and trying to invoke fear within the slaves as a way to kind of keep them in line. They will also return runaway slaves back to the plantation. They were primarily there to police the black people. And so what ended up happening with the slave patrol was when slavery ended in 1865 altogether, the slave patrol then they kind of morphed into this militia. And this militia then became responsible for enforcing these black codes, these codes that were again created to keep black people disempowered, disenfranchised, and to make sure that they did not have the same set of rights as white people. And so they turned into this militia. But what ended up happening when Jim Crow was created in 1868, Jim Crow again had the set of laws and legislation through which said separate but equal. What ended up happening was a lot of state and local entities, they then created these municipalities, which became like police departments. And these departments were responsible for reinforcing those Jim Crow laws. And so this eventually morphed into the police system that we know today. And I often hear people talk and complain about like the way that the police treats us and how they don't protect and serve the black people. And the police is not doing what it's designed to do. And I got to tell people the police system is doing exactly what it's designed to do. It was created to police black bodies. And that's what we see it doing. And how that affects us today is we as a group of people, we are well aware that the police system is not our like that the police is not our friends. The amount of fear that I know I feel going outside my home and I have to worry about is something going to happen to me? What happens if I get stopped by the police? Am I going to make it home? And that worry, that fear is something that we as Black people feel every day in America. And that affects our mental health because that's scary going outside and knowing that the people that we pay with our taxes who are supposed to protect us, they're not on our side. And that if we have an interaction with them, we may not make it home. And so, and then we also end up teaching our children and our babies about how to navigate the police system because we understand how racist it is. And having that conversation within itself, for a lack of a better word, it's a mind F because no one wants to have this conversation with the child, teaching them how to navigate the police because you have to sit and tell your black child the police is not your friend and not your protector. They don't see you this way. They may see you as a threat. Psychologically, that can affect us. Then I think about the civil rights era, how the civil rights era, we're fighting for equality, we're fighting for integration, and we're fighting for access to these places and spaces that they don't want us in. And then when the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, which pretty much made it illegal to discriminate on someone based off their racial identity, their ethnicity, their culture, their sexual orientation, their gender. Pretty much when that happened, that pretty much got rid of Jim Crow and, pretty much got rid of Jim Crow. And now everybody is supposed to magically have access to everything. But you know how this works. These are a group of people that did not want Black people in the spaces. So even though they cannot legally discriminate against us anymore, that does not mean that when we access the space, that we're still going to be treated with the respect and dignity that we deserve as Black people. And so oftentimes you will find Black people going into these spaces and still not being treated fairly, still being mistreated. And I think about how that kind of trickles over into today's society. I think about how even, like when we go into like our workspaces, we may be the only Black person there. And then we feel this whole thing of like we have to deal with microaggressions or feel with the energy of people not wanting us there and feel like we have to do twice as more to get half the respect. And people feeling like, hey, as we enter these spaces, we may not have to pay you accordingly because of your race. And people still feeling like you don't belong in that, feeling like you don't belong in the space, even though you have every last right to be there. And I sit here and tell people like all that is psychologically damaging for a Black person. Because it's like a very isolating and scary feeling when you know that you are the only one in the space or just a few in the space, and then you're experiencing all these microaggressions or all this behavior that make you feel like you're not wanted or make you feel like you're doing something wrong. And you got to sit here and kind of figure out exactly, am I tripping? Am I looking too much into things or just what I'm really into? And then you start having this psychological tug and war, which affects our mental state. And that's still a barrier that we face today. Us not being welcome in spaces, even though it says it's open to everybody. And then I want to talk about the barrier that the crack epidemic created. So, what many people don't realize about the crack epidemic was the hospitals and the hospitals and the medical system were just an extension of the judicial system. So if people were to go into the hospital or try to go get treatment for something that they experienced, and if the provider found that they were on crack or they had like a crack addiction, whatever, they would be obligated to report things to the judicial system. And then you saw people having their kids ripped away and put in the system. And the thing that I want to kind of highlight with the crack epidemic is this. I want to highlight that, like, at this point, you saw how the judicial system is set up against Black people. Because, when we try to seek help, we get criminalized for it. And then you look at the judicial system in general, like with the crack epidemic, zero point 0.5 grams of crack rock got you 5 years, while 500 grams of powdered cocaine got 5 years. There's a huge difference in the discrepancy there, especially knowing that like the majority of people who did crack rock were Black. And so you have this system targeting Black people. And then when you enter the court system, you find these people receiving harsh punishment for having an addiction. And you see this discrepancy, how the court system treats Black people. And then when you look at the statistics, as far as like sentencing for Black and white people when they do the same crime, you see Black people getting substantially more time. And a lot of this shows you how racist the judicial system is. And that can be a very, very scary place for Black people to realize that, like, hey, we get in trouble or if we do something, whatever, and go before a judge, we could be receiving significantly more time just because of the color of our skin. And the one thing I wanted to kind of highlight with the crack epidemic is I think about how the opioid epidemic has become a huge thing these past couple of years. And it's really interesting to see how people treat the opioid epidemic versus how they treat the crack epidemic. Because with the opioid epidemic, no, we shouldn't send them in jail. They should not be criminalized for having an addiction. They're human beings. Let's get them into rehab. Let's try to rehabilitate them. They weren't leading with criminalization and punishment. They were leading with compassion and trying to help the people. But when it came down to the crack epidemic, punish, 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 punish. And so I'm saying all that to kind of sit here and say is for us Black people, even when we sit here and have problems or things that affect us, we're not often met with compassion. We're met with criminalization, we may be met with punishment, and all that can lead to hell on our on our emotional and psychological well-being. So the third part of the speech, I want to talk a little bit about the distrust that Black people tend to have for the medical system. And I want to talk a little bit about how that affects our ability to go in and get help. So, what many people don't know is that, like a lot of modern day practices from gynecology, they stem from a man named Dr. Marion Sims. He is often credited as the father of gynecology, and he was alive during that era of slavery. And what many people don't know is that a lot of the techniques that he developed them while practicing them on Black women, Black slaves specifically. And he would practice on them without using anesthesia because he was underneath this false assumption that Black people don't feel no pain. And that's something that we still hear today when you look at how doctors see Black patients, where they may feel like, oh, they don't feel no pain or they can tolerate more. They kind of see us more as humans. So you see this being trickled down today. And what he did, again, made Black people feel uncomfortable within, like, receiving medical services. And then I go into what happened in 1932 with the Tuskegee Project, where 600 Black people, they were basically used as test subject without their knowledge because they thought that they were just getting free health care, free lunches, and free burial insurance, but they had no idea that they were being injected with syphilis and that the researchers had planned to inject them and just watch what happens when it goes untreated. So these people were injected with syphilis, didn't receive any treatment, even when the people had developed a cure in 1947, which was penicillin. They still did not give the treatment to the people they infected the syphilis with. Sorry, the people that they infected them with syphilis, they didn't give them the cure. And so then what ended up happening is a lot of these men ended up dying or passing down diseases to their offsprings or their partner. And it's sad. And that kind of built this distrust between Black people and the medical system. And then I want to talk about Henrietta Lacks, how she went to Johns Hopkins, I believe, in 1951, and they extracted her tumor cells without her knowledge or consent. And now her cells are basically the cornerstone of biomedical research. Her cells have been used to create vaccines for polio and even the COVID-19 vaccine. And she didn't give them permission to utilize her cell. And so they've been making all these vaccines, all these things, and been receiving profit off for something that belongs to Henrietta Lacks, but yet Henrietta Lacks has not been compensated or her family has not received any compensation. And this leads to further distrust with the medical system. And then going back to the crack epidemic again, I talked about this a couple of minutes ago, where I said when the Black people would go into the hospitals and into these systems to try to receive treatment, they would often be punished. They would have their kids separated. They would have their kids taken from them and the kids being put in the system. Or guess what? These people that had addiction problems would be incarcerated. So all of this leads to this level of distrust when it comes down to going to the medical system. And so you may be thinking, like, how does this affect Black people in terms of them getting treatment? Well, mental health treatment. And when I see and talk about Black people entering mental health treatment, we face our own barriers there. Number one, it's already hard for us to get in the space to go get help because for a lot of us, we're already mistrusting of people. But when you look at the mental health field and look at the clinicians who are within it, the majority of the clinicians happen to be white women. And so imagine wanting to be able to get therapy, but you struggle to find someone who is culturally competent. You may want somebody who looks like you. People who look like me who provide therapy, Black men, again, it's like trying to find a needle in a haystack. So now, for a lot of Black people, we face that whole barrier trying to find someone who can pretty much understand us, who's gonna be a right fit for us, who's a culturally competent. Because, like in my mind, I think about this one story of this girl I had saw because she had talked about this on TikTok, where she was working with her white therapist. She had said something simple as, "I was with my friends, we were just turned up, blah blah blah," and the white therapist didn't understand what turned up meant. And then I believe she ended up trying to Baker act the person as though she thought that the girl had some suicidal tendency because she didn't understand the terminology. Those things make a difference in someone seeking mental health treatment because no one wants to sit here and open up or go to a place where they feel like I'm going to tell you some of my most vulnerable moments and vulnerable experiences, and the person I'm talking to may not be able to understand or support me through it. So the lack of culturally competent clinicians serve as a problem for Black people accessing mental health treatment. And then I also think about the Black people that, okay, you know what? I am going to access mental health treatment, but maybe I don't have the insurance. And so, how do I find a way to kind of sit here and pay for mental health when I'm not making enough money? When, I don't have insurance, where a session can run me anywhere between 75 to $150. That stuff makes a difference. And it also serves as a barrier it also serves a barrier for Black people not receiving treatment, especially if you don't have health insurance. And then lastly, I think about the amount of resources that are available for Black mental health. Because historically, when people talk about counseling, they go into like the mental health field. Most of the research, most of the studies are done for white people. Most of the textbooks censor white people. Black and brown people, we are not in that conversation. And so they often create material that may not be palatable towards us. And then we get this material about mental health and we may not be able to fully understand it because they didn't write it in a way that is adjustable for us. And that serves as a barrier for us getting treatment or not even understanding certain things such as anxiety or depression or what it looks like. Because like we can read the textbook, but it may not be written in ways that we understand. Or it may not be applicable to the everyday Black experience because they focus solely on white people. Those things make a difference. So I want to kind of conclude the speech by basically giving you guys some tips about how to take care of your own mental health and start your own mental health journey. If you want to go to therapy and just don't know where to start, and you're looking for a therapist, www.psychologytoday.com is your friend. It is a database that contains all the therapists, and it allows you to type in your zip code and to find local therapists within your area. And you also have the option to filter what type of therapist you want: male, female, Black, white. It gives you that option. So if you're looking for a therapist and don't know where to start, that is a place that can help you. www.psychologytoday.com. If you don't have the financial resources to seek a therapy but still want to start your own work, I also recommend daily journaling. Sorry, daily journaling. It gives you an opportunity and a chance to really write down how you feel and get that out so that you won't be carrying it with you. And it allows you to kind of process how you feel and see it on paper and begin trying to develop different ways looking at yourself and your situation. So journaling is your friend. I will also say if you are someone that has like severe anxiety and you want to learn how to do breath work and do meditation, YouTube has a host of free meditations that you can access. You don't have to get a subscription. You can go type in meditation for anxiety or depression, and then you can listen to these things and have them guide you through breathing exercises and meditation work. Those things can serve as a huge benefit to you if you don't know exactly where to start. And then if you are the type of person where you need to find a community, what is like a support group for Black people, don't be afraid to use the internet to kind of search for support groups within your area or support groups online. All those things can serve as something that can be beneficial to you. And that's pretty much it for me for today. I am open to questions. I am open to conversation. If anybody got feedback, questions, or concerns, please feel free to raise your hand or just unmute yourself and just ask the question, and I'll gladly answer anything that you ask.
Thank you, Thomas. I really appreciate you spending time with us today. And it's the history goes deep. When we talk about like the disenfranchisement of Black and Brown folks here. And I appreciate the education of like everything that is like taken into account when we think about like the mental health states of Black and Brown folks. I also really appreciate you giving some resources for folks. I was like, I know we have a local resource. Rod does breath work. Um, and so he hosts classes and yeah, I think it's important for folks to have these resources in our community for sure. And I know that we have a few here in Humboldt, even though it is a small community. But yeah, if anyone has any questions or comments, please let us know.
Yeah, I have a question.
Let's go ahead.
Um, so yeah, I started warming up to the idea of therapy probably about like 2 years ago. I had a lot of skepticism about it, just skepticism about Western medicine, period. But started to really be open to it. And my struggle was in finding a therapist because I was looking for a Black therapist, male or female, didn't matter, but I just wanted a Black therapist. And didn't didn't end up finding one. But my question is, if the time comes that I do find a therapist, what what should I do before so that I could be like most prepared to have impact with my therapy? Like what questions should I be asking and how should I be prepared?
Okay, so I'm gonna do a shameless plug right now of my book, The Miseducation of Thomas Lee Crockett, A Mental Health Love Letter to the Black Community. So, which comes out June 30th. It's gonna be available in Target, Walmart, Barnes and Noble, and all those other things. I actually put a section in the book about how to find the appropriate therapist. And I usually tell
Mm.
people when you're looking for a therapist, okay, number one, what goals am I trying to achieve? I will say this honestly, if I'm somewhere having issues related to my race, I'm probably gonna need someone who looks like me. However, I gotta tell people this too. Black people have issues outside of their blackness. We have like family stuff, we have stuff with our friends, like general stuff that everybody face. And with stuff like that, where if I know that if I'm dealing with some type of trauma that's not related to my race or some type of something that's related to my relationship that does not have anything to do with my race, I can go to another therapist who doesn't look like me. It's different versus when I'm having like black related issues. So I'm saying all that to say, what are my issues? Let me kind of address this. So if I know that I'm having something related directly to my blackness or my experience as a black person, I may want to find someone who's black. So let me just kind of be clear on what my goals and my objectives are. If like in terms of why I'm going to therapy. So it's gonna make it a little bit easier for me to try to find someone who may be a right match. And then when you sit here and you find your therapist, I always tell people the first question you need to ask your therapist, first question always need to be, are you in therapy? And and the reason why I ask that is like, how can I sit here and preach to you to go to therapy if I'm not drinking my own medicine?
Mm.
So I don't have to know exactly what you talk about, but do you just got a therapist? Is there someone that you're talking to? Because even our healers need to be healed by other people and also need to be checking ourselves. I think that is a very, very important question that you need to ask your therapist. And then as you're saying, like getting ready for the process, I just think that you have to be open to therapy because many people go into therapy and think that like, oh my gosh, that is not going to be easy or blah 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 this and that. You are in a very, very vulnerable space. And I typically tell people like trying to find a therapist is like the equivalent of trying to find the right partner. And basically, you may have to date your therapist before you kind of decide you really want to thoroughly commit. So I typically tell people, give your therapist 3 to 4 sessions to kind of see if you like this or if you're cool, because I kind of feel like you gotta, because like what's the word? You can't go into it expecting like in the first session, I'm gonna get this out of this and this out of that, blah blah blah. No, it's like you have to really vibe out and really see if you feel comfortable with the individual that's offering you services. And just because the first time you meet with a therapist, that like like it probably wasn't a pleasant experience. For a lot of people, this is their first time in therapy, so they don't know how to feel. And
Mm-hmm.
that's why I say, like, hey, for at least 4 sessions to kind of see if we're a right fit, 3 to 4. And so I feel like giving that an opportunity just to kind of see, hey, okay, I see a different facet. I could work, blah, blah, blah. All those things are important to kind of help you find the right therapist. And at any point, if you feel like, hey, there's a barrier, or you feel like you're not going to be able to open up, especially after giving it 3 or 4 tries, at that point, you just got to go back to the drawing board and trying to find somebody else who is a right fit. And hopefully that answers your question.
That was great. Thank you. One more time, what's the name of your book?
The Miseducation of Thomas Lee Crockett, a mental health love letter to the Black community. I know it's a long title.
I can put it in our chat.
Thank you. Oh, and last question. I want to buy that book. So is there a way that I could buy it directly and not support, Amazon and all these kind of things?
I can't I can't sell the copies anymore. My team made me take them down. So basically, Walmart's an option. If you don't want to do Amazon, are we still boycotting? I think we are still boycotting Target, despite what Jay-Z says. So Walmart or thriftstore.com, I don't have any way to sell it to you directly because this new version, I have the old version. My team has the ones on shelf is a new version.
Yeah,
Fair enough. I'll figure it out.
I was gonna say too, Bridget put that you can order it through like Northtown. I know that the bookstore in Eureka also orders books. And then if you look into the Reparations Club, they are a website that you could order books from. And it's I believe this is a Black owned bookstore in LA. Black owned and woman owned.
Is there any more questions?
I think for me, I just had a thought when I was hearing you speak, and it was just like the realization that like the tactics have never changed. Like we see it today with the Trump administration to like take away folks' education, take away their rights, separate communities, limit folks' ability to be a family, right? We see families being separated with this mass deportation, and it's alarming that this entity is still like bucking it, and writhing. And yeah, I was just like, I just had that realization like, wow, the tactics are just as embedded and rooted as they've ever been. We think about um the enslavement of Black and brown folks and ripping folks from their culture and their land as like something that happened hundreds of years ago when it's so prominent today. And I think that's something a lot of folks don't realize.
Yeah, I think people fail to realize that like as society has evolved, racism has also evolved to fit the times. I think as Black people, we've always been in a place and space of where when we were brought into this country, we weren't given any respect. And play this, if you start off not respecting somebody and you've been allowed to not respect them, there's been laws in place that empowers you not to respect them. And then all of a sudden you sit here and you stop. You're supposed to stop legally and all this other stuff. Do you expect the people that have been doing this for years to just give up doing what they were just doing? And
Hmm.
so, and I think that's why we kind of see like this a lot of pushback, or why you see people trying to disempower or steadily keep Black people disenfranchised. Because, like, again, you start off not as an equal. So why are we going to see you as an equal now just because something says that you're free? And so, any places and spaces where we can sit here and disempower you, we may take it because unfortunately, I think about something. I remember watching this episode of Pose, and I think it was
Hmm.
when Blanca and the girl was trying to get into like the gay bar, and they didn't want them in there because they were trans individual. And I remember, yeah, Lulu, and they had kicked Blanca and Lulu out, and Lulu was mad because like she asked Blanca, "Why did you drag us in here?" And she was like, "Look, the thing is like this: they're never going to accept us. They don't want us in there because." Everybody needs someone everybody needs someone that they can feel superior then. And for the gay boys, even though like they're discriminated too or whatever, it's us, the trans people. And I feel like the same can be said for society where there are some like white people still want to feel superior. And so everyone needs somebody to itch on. And unfortunately, it's for Black people, not only for the whites, but it can also be for the Asians, the Latinos, and all this other stuff. And it's just the reality.
Thank you. We did have a question in the chat. How would the state of mental health be defined? What does it mean to be mentally healthy?
I think that okay, so I think that's gonna vary for each person because I feel
Hmm.
like wellness look different for everybody. And so I think like how I kind of define mental healthiness, right? How I define like mental healthiness is pretty much number one, am I able to emotionally regulate
Hmm.
when I feel like life is throwing something at me or I'm having problems with my friends, my relationship? Am I able to sit here and emotionally regulate and deal with the situation? Because
Hmm.
how I choose to emotionally regulate says a lot about what place I am. Do I find myself blowing up? Do I find myself having anxiety attacks? Do I find myself not being able to function? Or when I'm faced with this adversity within the world, do I find myself being able to emotionally regulate and deal with this in a mature manner? So I think emotional regulation is number one. Then I also think about awareness level. Am I aware of myself? Am I aware of how I may be coming off or how what I may be doing may be affecting other people? It does like I tell people like sometimes we may unintentionally do something or may not know that we're doing something, but I think what happens is, am I aware of what I'm doing? Because the awareness of myself lets me know exactly how it is that I can navigate situations and how it may be impacting those around them. And so with that awareness, I can begin to sit here and, like just monitor my behavior, just make sure that I'm not affecting those around me. And I think those are the two signs for me that kind of indicates somebody's mental wellness in terms of like, hey, their ability to emotionally regulate and their ability to be aware. And let me also kind of say this too. Also, let me kind of mention the third. How is it that I'm taking care of myself? Because I have to realize now that a lot of people don't know how to take care of themselves. I see it a lot with clients of where like I've been so busy working, blah 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 blah. Now I got this free time and I don't know what to do. So now I'm just sitting here just waiting on something bored. I don't know exactly how it is that I take care of myself. I don't know how it is that I check in on myself. So how is it I'm taking care of myself? Do I sit here and give myself spa days as a way to kind of like love on my body, rejuvenate? Do I sit and take some time to sit here and do some meditation? Do I go to a yoga class? How am I doing my own self-care? Because I also feel like someone's level of self-care tells you where they're at in terms of like their mental wellness. Because I know one thing I do with my friends here when we have this conversation, I ask them, because like a lot of my friends have a lot of high power jobs. And I ask them like, okay, so it's great that you got all this going on, but have you taken a mental health day? And usually they tell me like, no, I have not taken one. I'm looking like schedule one. You need to go schedule a mental health day and take care of yourself because that's very, very important. That also shows a sign of like your maturity is like your mental wellness as well. Because now take it back to awareness. The reason why I say you need to be aware is sometimes we get to these places where we are burnt out and we don't know that we're burnt out, but we're still engaging in these things. And I feel like you need that awareness in order to kind of see and tell you that I'm burnt out. And when I am burnt out, how am I how am I choosing to replenish myself? That is very, very important because just because I do something, it does not mean that it's going to get my battery back to where it needs to be. So that's where that self-care component comes in. So to answer those questions, three things. I think it's emotional regulation, self-awareness, and your ability to take care of yourself, self-care. But again, make sure that that looks like, make sure you keep in mind that looks different for everybody else. What I do and how I emotion regulate and how I self-care is not going to be the same. And so be okay with your individualistic process.
Thank you for that. AJ says very illuminating. And he
Thank you.
thanks you. Any more questions before we close out?
Yeah, I got one more question. You were talking about journaling earlier. Do you have like any suggestions as far as journaling questions or workbooks to use?
Um, yeah. Also, another shameless plug for my book. I actually put resources inside the book to for other mental health resources that you can use to kind of like learn more about anxiety, take care of and develop these skills. So that's in the book too. So in terms of like journal prompt, what I typically can tell you to do, I start, at least for me personally, this is what I do. I kind of ask myself like, what am I feeling today? I try to recognize my feelings. So if I'm feeling angry, I gotta ask myself, like, okay, I'm feeling angry. So what's causing me to feel this way? Is there like a certain memory that I'm starting to experience that's kind of like bringing up these feelings and start going there to kind of see, to start journaling, trying to talk about exactly what about that feeling makes me sad and how does that relate to what I'm experiencing today or in the current state of my life? So I would say that one. And then I would just say like just in journaling in general. Um, Again, acknowledging what you feel for the day and writing prompts on that, that's usually where I start. I can't think out of my head any direct books that give you journal prompt, but usually the emotion that you're feeling and exploring that gets you started.
Thank you. I'm definitely gonna check out that book now.
Sorry. I think something that's also been helpful in like my healing journey is like I have realized that a lot of my trauma, I mean, they say your body keeps the score. And
Mhm.
so a lot of body work has been really healing for me. Um and also like acknowledging like when I'm holding pain, when I'm holding tension, what is like I think sometimes it's hard to put a name to an emotion or feeling, but I'm someone who like lives in my sensations. So I'm like, oh, my skin is crawling right now. What does that mean? Does it mean I'm anxious? Does it mean I'm nervous? Does it mean and like kind of sensing like my body sensations and then putting words to that and then expanding on like why am I feeling this way? What is coming up for me? What is triggering me in this moment? Um,
I, I was gonna say, I think you make a great point because let me kind of go back a little bit because I also know this too. Sometimes in my field or whatever, I used to work with people that could not identify emotions whatsoever. And so usually I
Mm.
would have flashcards. I'm like, okay, so this as a way to try to give them language to identify those emotions. And so what's really, really funny is I would tell people this, like, I didn't discover that I was feeling certain feelings until I started listening to Lana Del Rey, her first album, Born to Die. And I'm like, I'm just really connecting with this whole sad and somberness, blah, 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 blah. And I didn't realize that, like, oh, I was having these type of emotions. And a lot of the music that I tend to listen to corresponds with how I feel because sometimes I may not have the verbiage or I may not know exactly what it is, but I know that, like, this particular song feels right. And so what I would suggest in terms of like a journal prompt, if there's like a particular song you need to kind of like use to kind of like self-soothe or express how you feel or whatever, I would tell people like put that song on. And then as I'm listening to that, what's coming up for me and begin trying to identify exactly like what about the song that I'm connecting with as a way to kind of start the whole journaling process prompt.
I definitely got some of those songs, so that'll be a good start.
We had a comment in the chat. Just wanted to express gratitude for taking time of your day to organize and speak to all of us. I appreciate the knowledge and history you provide as it connects to the present and good question/dialogue too. Thank you. Yeah, thank you all for being here.
Well, I was gonna say, if that's it for the questions and everything, I do want to express gratitude for allowing me into the space and give me the opportunity to speak to you guys and share with you my knowledge and my experience. Hopefully, there were some takeaways that you took from this experience with me. I wish everybody nothing but love and light as you continue on your journey.
Thank you.